What is a smart city? A smart city is a concept that emerged about 2 years ago in the literature and is now on everybody's lips. But of course, as happens with those kinds of things, it hasn't really been defined in a coherent way. So what I want to do first is give you a sense of some of the qualities that I think and some of my colleagues here at ASU think are part of what a smart city should actually have. For one, such a city should be resilient, in the sense that it is designed not only for permanence, but also for change, and it is able to profit from events that are happening, whether external, like natural calamities, or internal, social unrest, to actually change the way it works, to change some of its infrastructure, to change its management, to change its operations. In particular, it needs also to be so managed that it uses the minimum amount of resources that is needed. Not to say that we should really completely change our lifestyles, that may also be part of it at some point, but it's basically a question of efficiency. We need to manage resources as efficiently as we possibly can, and I will get to that in a moment, where that will actually work out. The next thing that it needs to do in order to achieve those goals is it needs to be much more aware of what is actually happening in the city. Right now, we are sort of roughly aware, and city managers are roughly aware, and they're more precise aware of, for example, water shortages or electricity problems than what is actually happening socially in the city. But that is just as important, if not at some points more important, than being aware of the physical conditions in the city. In order to do that, the city needs to build a network of sensors that sense behavior, shortages, temperatures, what have you, all around, so that it actually has all the data that are necessary to do that kind of sustainable management. On top of that, and that is not the same thing at all, even if that information is available, and when it is available, people need to be able to make intelligent decisions. So they need to look not only at lessons from the past, they need to look at lessons for the future. Now, those two things are very different. Much of science so far has always, because we have to prove everything we say, linked the present to the past, because the only thing you can ever prove is something that has already happened. When we start looking more closely at the future, we need to start looking at the probabilities. We need to start building more scenarios. We need to start, in general, train ourselves to think about the consequences of what we're actually doing, to see where we have to make different decisions, where we have unintended consequences that later down the line might actually land us back into trouble. Once those decisions have been made, such smart cities need to have integrated management platforms that are so efficient that the various sectors are actually linked together. That, in many cities, is far from the case. You have the water managers, the energy managers, the real estate managers, the social services, and all those different sectors, but there is, so far, a huge shortage of cross-analysis of those kinds of sectors. And then finally, it's absolutely fundamental that such a city engages its own citizens, that it uses its own potential for innovation, for thinking, for leading, but also engages its citizens in the fundamental decisions that are being made. With very large cities, that is of course incredibly difficult. Yet you cannot divide them up into smaller parts because everything links together. So what you do need to do is you need to use information technology to begin to link people better into what is happening, create transparency, things like that. Now, what makes all of this possible? And that is again a major development in information and communication technology. As we're now all linked to the web, our computers have got such incredible not only data storage power, but also treatment power, that we can begin to individualize how we monitor people, because we can actually begin to deal with those huge quantities of data. To give you an example from the last presidential campaign in the United States, at the core of that campaign was the fact that there are a couple of companies in this country who remain very discreet and in the background, who have for every citizen about 500 parameters about their behavior, their background, their economic situation, their shopping behavior, and so on and so forth. Those databases have been used to predict what would be the response of people going from house to house in the two campaigns, to what the response would be to the people they actually meet when they rang the bell. And so they could prepare their arguments. That has been a very, very powerful tool. But it goes much further than that. In the medical world right now, people are talking about personalized medicine, which basically is a shift in the same sense from looking at populations statistically and trying to get statistical improvements in health to getting individual improvements in health by fine-tuning the prescription of medicines, behavioral changes, much earlier warning for individuals about their chances of getting a particular illness, because those are genetically determined. So what we're beginning to see is genetic determination on chips, very simple, relatively cheap, and on the basis of that, a much improved health situation. Well, the same thing needs to happen in cities. Cities need to begin to deal with that. They need to start planning much more smartly. I'll give you one example that happened a number of years ago. An Indian colleague of mine, Arama Ravi, took apart the existing economy of the city of Goa, analyzed all its details, all its interdependencies, and then created a model of how you might recreate the city, rebuild it in this case, which of course is never going to happen, but it's an interesting exercise, by not thinking from the city going outward, but by thinking from the environment going inward, so that you get a completely differently structured city, which is much more energy efficient, much more resource efficient, and so on and so forth. So that kind of planning is necessary. Cities need to be seen as ecosystems. The next element in that particular perspective is that we need to use the collective smarts of the city. And I've already talked about that. It is basically a question of citizen participation. Mobilizing information systems in such a way that people passively participate in the sense that their data are going into the database, but that they also actively participate, that they actually have such a transparent governance and decision-making system that they can very easily let their voice be heard in that system and therefore help in the development of the city. A third element of all of this is smart infrastructures. Infrastructures that sense just about anything. Temperature, humidity, degree of degradation, vibrations, human behavior. That can be done by building them into the buildings, building them into the streets and roads, building them into the distribution systems, but also building them into our cell phones to actually monitor our own behavior. All kinds of experiments are being done with that, in particular on energy consumption, and ultimately I think that is a trend that will really take over. The next one is smart operations. Once you have all that data and you have made your fundamental decisions, you need to really create an infrastructure for transport, for behavior, but also an infrastructure for information treatment that actually allows the city to operate much more seamlessly. I've talked a moment ago about the fact that a lot of that right now is sectoral, but that needs to change. And then finally, I'm coming back to what most people don't take into account, and that is this very important aspect of smart governance. You need to govern together. You need to go back to a system where it's not all top-down, but where things that are living in society are actually used and valued. One of the ways to do that is by an approach that you could call emergence by design. It is basically a question of crowdsourcing on a real-time basis, sort of what lives in the city among its citizens. And then try and select from those things that are there and the solutions that are being suggested, those that seem actually relevant and interesting to try and implement.